Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's returning guest is Jeremy Hammond. He previously came on to speak about the destruction of Gaza and some of the intent behind it. And today we're going to talk about something related to that. There's been a lot of discussion about pinning kind of things on Netanyahu and their right-wing government. And I'm not a person to call everything right-wing because it is used as, just a slur towards anyone who's a bit more on the conservative side, but genuine, strongly settler-based people like Ben Gurvey and Smotrich, where a lot of the pinning of the blame or some of their actions goes on to them. Some of the racist remarks they make about the Palestinians and the dehumanizing. So I thought we could have a general discussion about Israeli society. Is there a level of racism and dehumanizing there? If so, how does that come out in policies? How does it come out in this conflict? How does it come out with the settler regime? And I guess how their religious view can come into it. And if this is, I guess, the majority of Israeli society or a smaller portion. So I thought we could just have a discussion around that. But thanks again for coming on, Jeremy. How are you doing?
Doing all right. Thanks for having me on again.
So just jumping straight into it, we can get to people like Smotrich, Ben Gurvey later, who, recently made comments like Smotrich said, if we could starve 2 million Palestinians, we morally should, but politically it's just not doable. That literally just came out and said that. And, these people in the middle being accused of genocide, and the ICJ has ruled potential intent of genocide. And he's basically just said 2 million Palestinians deserve to die, to starve to death or starve, to save our hostages, and that's morally right. We can get to that sort of stuff later. But as Israel as a society, the general population, is it a racist society towards the Palestinians? Do they see them as sub below? Do they dehumanize them? And then we can kind of get into how that plays out. But did you share the belief that this isn't just a specific group of maybe settlers in the West Bank who have come from those areas or support the ideas of Greater Israel? How do you see it in the whole of Israeli society?
Sure. Well, to start with, in answering that question of, is Israeli society racist? I want to there's a caveat before that I want to preface my answer to that with, which is that, I want to draw a clear distinction between the Israeli government and the state and Israeli society, the Israeli people, as distinct from the government and the state. But the answer to the question is yes. Is the Israeli society isn't a racist society, and obviously there are exceptions to that. And the reason for this, the primary reason for this, is that Israelis are indoctrinated into racist beliefs by their government. And so the Israeli state is a criminally racist regime. This has been increasingly recognized by international human rights organizations, UN bodies, and Israeli human rights organizations as well. Examples including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Yesh Din, Gisha, and they have all recognized the regime of Israel as an apartheid regime. And for the simple reason that the government systematically discriminates against Palestinians, the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. Israel was created through the ethnic cleansing of most of the Arab population from their homes in Palestine in 1948. That's how Israel was established. There's myths about how Israel was established. A lot of people think, for example, that it was created through some kind of legitimate political process involving the United Nations and the so-called partition plan, Resolution 181. But that's a load of nonsense and a historical myth. The UN Resolution 181 neither partitioned Palestine nor conferred any legal authority to the Zionist leadership for their unilateral declaration of the existence of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, in which they essentially declared sovereignty over land that was not theirs. The Jewish community at the time owned about 7% of the land in Palestine. Arabs owned more land in every single district of Palestine. And of course, Arabs remained the majority, despite the best efforts of the Zionists utilizing British guns under the belligerent British occupation post-World War I to facilitate the Zionist project of reconstituting Palestine into a demographically Jewish state. Despite that effort, Jews remained only about 33% of the population, with the increase in Jewish population being mostly due to immigration, in contrast to the increase of the Arab population being natural increase. And so it was a settler colonialist project from the start, a racist project from the start, in which the rights of the indigenous inhabitants of the land were prejudiced. The League of Nations mandate for Palestine first of all, it was drafted by the Zionists for their own interests, and it violated the League of Nations' own covenant, because the whole purpose of the mandatory system under the League of Nations covenant was explicitly to hold territories in trust by the international community, with this specific aim of assisting peoples of former Ottoman territories in their exercise of self-determination. So the whole point was like a promise to the people of the region of formerly Ottoman territories that we are going to help you establish your own independent states. This was the whole purpose. This was the whole stated aim of the mandatory system under the League of Nations. And yet, when it came to Palestine, Palestine was exempted from that, where that the goal with Palestine was to essentially to implement the Zionist project to reconstitute Palestine with great prejudice towards the rights of the Palestinians, including property rights and political rights. And of course, the Arabs at the time were advocating a single democratic state in which the rights of the minority, meaning particularly the Jews, the Jewish population, the Jewish minority, would be protected. But the Zionists and their Western backers rejected the democratic solution in favor of the use of force, essentially. And so the policy course that the British government was set on as a result of the Balfour Declaration of 1917 ultimately facilitated the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and that is how Israel came into existence. So you can go back to pre-Israel history there and see that from the outset, Zionism, the political secular movement, was a racist ideology, in which it's a Jewish supremacist ideology, and Israel today is a Jewish supremacist state. And to illustrate that, we need look no further than the 2018 Jewish nation state law that was passed by the Knesset, which became part of what's called the Basic Law. So Israel does not have a constitution, but it has what's called Basic Law, which is essentially its constitutional legislation. And so that law explicitly defines the right to self-determination as a right exclusive to Jews in the territory under Israel's control. So it's a Jewish supremacist state, outright, unashamedly. No controversy about that whatsoever. And so when you have this type of government, when you have this apartheid regime and this Jewish supremacist state, that is perverting Israelis' minds, because they're indoctrinated into this belief that they are superior to the indigenous Arab population. And this is embedded in their laws, and this is the reason why increasingly Israel has been recognized by international authorities as an apartheid regime, including most recently the International Court of Justice, which very recently issued its advisory opinion requested by the UN General Assembly on the legal consequences of Israel's persistent occupation of Palestinian territory. And so in its most recent ruling, which is separate, by the way, from the ICJ, also has an ongoing case brought by South Africa accusing Israel of genocide. That's a separate case. But in this other case brought by the General Assembly, the ICJ went further than its 2004 advisory opinion, in which it was requested to examine the legal consequences of Israel's settlement regime and the wall that was being constructed by Israel in the West Bank, which was essentially an annexation wall, strategically designed to separate, to encompass most of the largest settlement blocks, to essentially annex them, de facto annex them into Israeli territory. And the ICJ in that ruling in 2004 determined that, yes, the settlement regime is a violation of international law, and the wall was being constructed in violation of international law. So it's illegal. And other aspects of the occupation are violate international law. So in more recent ruling, just I don't know if it was last month or 2 months ago, it was quite recent, the ICJ went beyond that and ruled not only do a multitude of aspects of Israel's occupation violate international law, but the occupation itself is illegal. And in issuing that ruling, it also cited the discriminatory policies, the systemic and systematic discrimination of Israeli policies against Palestinians, and citing chapter and verse of international law, where the ICJ didn't explicitly conclude and describe Israel's occupation as an apartheid regime, but they cited international law describing this type of discrimination that they were condemning as illegal. And so the law that they were citing actually refers to this type of discrimination as apartheid. And that's what apartheid is under international law. The definition of apartheid is systematic discrimination based on, race, ethnicity, religion, or other aspects. It's not necessarily only race, as was the case predominantly the case in South Africa. So people tend to think of apartheid as what was the situation in South Africa, and people will say, oh, well, it's not really parallel to the situation in Israel. Okay, granted, fine. That's not how apartheid is defined under international law, although that's how apartheid was originally used. The term it has since been codified under international law with a broader definition encompassing different types of discrimination based on different factors. So it's not just about race. So the answer to the question is yes. Israel society is a racist society fundamentally, and that follows unavoidably from the constitution of the state. And by constitution, I don't mean legal constitution, because again, there is no constitution in Israel. I mean in the way it was formed and grounded, and the principles and ideology upon which it was created.
Yeah, even with the UN route, I find it interesting because the way we live now, the UN is part of our life and it's recognized. But if you really think about it back then, and obviously the Jews as people have been terrorized throughout history for a very long time, across Europe, the pogroms in Eastern Europe, and obviously the Nazis, and other parts of the world previously, not just Europe too. But I find it interesting that Israel was eventually kind of founded out of post-Holocaust, and that was done, by the Nazis, Germany and Europe, and other European countries. The treatment of the Jews in Eastern Europe, the pogroms, all of that happens, and then those same powerful Western countries who created the League of Nations and then the United Nations. The United Nations as an organization was about 1 year old. The nations who were the ones who perpetrated a lot of the anti-Semitism and contributed, to the Jews in Europe, then vote for the Jews to have a homeland away from them in the Middle East. Whether you want to say Palestine was a country before, the Arabs who lived there. Mm-hmm. They're put on the burden of, well, the Jews have been terrorized through history, which everyone agrees on. So now they need a state, and they need it here. And if it was about security, then what, you always hear people, pro-Israel people say, they're surrounded by neighbors who want to hurt them, who hate the Jews, hate them. If it was about security, why would you choose an area of the world like the Middle East, where it's surrounded by Muslims, rather than somewhere else? It was looked at other countries like I think it was the Congo and other places in East Africa, but they chose Palestine overall because of religious reasons, that they were the chosen people to go there rather than security. So I find it quite interesting, especially people who more lean on the right, who say, like in the UK, they're against immigration at the moment, but they're pro-Israel. And I find it funny because it was like, he'd say like Hindu countries were terrorizing Muslims throughout history, and then Hindu countries created an organization and then voted to create a Muslim country in the middle of Europe surrounded by Christians. Kind of like people getting scared now about an Islamic state being created in Europe. They're like, no, they're not going to integrate into our culture. They shouldn't be there. But then that's what happened with Israel. And that's a bit of a sideshow. But it's interesting. Even if you go down the UN route, it doesn't really make much sense because the organization was about a year old, and the Western nations who voted on it were partly responsible for what happened. You know, obviously Germany with the Nazis. But going back to what you said there with today rather than its founding, as people may say, maybe it was founded. Obviously, the 750,000 people who moved out are now in Gaza. That was colonial. But Israeli society today, you brought up one of the laws. Is there any other example of laws or policies or votes in the Knesset that show Israel's view of the Palestinians? Anything else that you think would be a good example?
Sure, numerous, and that goes to the point of many people who argue that, well, Israel isn't an apartheid state because, look, you know, Arabs can run for government and participate in the Knesset, which is Israel's legislature, and you know they can vote and participate in the political system in Israel. And so, you know, how could you? Israel is the Middle East's only democracy. We constantly hear this mantra. But that's actually not true. It's not true that Arabs have equal rights within Israel. And so it's not only when you look at Israel's policies in the occupied territories, which means Gaza Strip and all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem, contrary to how the media often report it, is not disputed territory. East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank. It's part of it's considered occupied Palestinian territory. It's not disputed. Not at all. And there are many laws that are discriminatory against Israel's Arab population. And starting with, again, going back to how Israel was established through the ethnic cleansing of most of the population. So that's why when people say, well, look, 20% of Israel today is Palestinian. So how can you say there was ethnic cleansing? Well, that's why it's only 20%. Again, Arabs used to be the majority, and most of them were expelled from their homes. So that's why it's only 20% today. And before I kind of give into some examples of some of these laws, and I already mentioned one, the 2018 Jewish nation state law. There's a couple of other points there that you kind of raised that I'd like to touch on briefly. So one, again, going back to the distinction between the Israeli people and the Israeli government, you know, going back to the origin of the Zionist movement when it first arose, it was by and large opposed by many Jews. Orthodox Jews opposed it because they saw it as, again, it being a secular political movement. They saw it as heretical because they viewed their exile as a punishment from God for violating the covenant. Read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Tanakh. The Hebrew people had violated the Tanakh. You had the United Kingdom of Israel, and then it was separated. You know, in the biblical text, it was separated into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and then you had the Assyrian exile, in which the kingdom of Israel was dissolved and eliminated. And the lesson in the prophets was that, well, look, speaking to Judah and Benjamin, which are the two tribes living in the southern kingdom of Judah. The lesson to them was, look at what happened to those 10 tribes because of their sinful ways and their sinful habits. This is God's retribution for their sins. And the Bible describes that as God having issued a, quote, certificate of divorce, unquote, with those 10 tribes. Essentially they had violated the covenant. And so that was a warning to the southern kingdom of Judah. And then what happened? Same thing, that they'd persist in their sinful ways. And then you had the Babylonian exile. And how does the Bible describe that? Well, the same way. And so Orthodox Jews at the time had viewed the diaspora, their exile from, that land in the Middle East as, as punishment for their sins. And in their interpretation of the text was that they had to await the coming of the Messiah. And it was only after the Messiah would come that they would be returned to the land. And so they viewed the Zionist movement as essentially heretical, an act, a movement of men who were acting in defiance of God's will, not waiting for the Messiah, and trying to reestablish Israel on their own without God. So it was heretical to them. So that's Orthodox Jews who were anti-Zionist. And then you also had, Jews who had kind of more assimilated into European societies who also opposed Zionism, because they viewed it essentially not through such a religious lens, but they viewed it as kind of a threat to their own ability to live in European cultures, without, kind of rocking the boat and creating anti-Semitism. And so it wasn't opposed by all Jews by any means, but certainly there were anti-Zionist Jews, particularly among those who were kind of more assimilating into European cultures, because they were kind of had the attitude of like, well, we're living here and we're fine, and like we're being told that Jews should mass migrate to Palestine, but we're living here. This is our home. So it wasn't. There was a divide within the Jewish community in Europe over Zionism. So that's a point that I think is important to stress. And to this day, there are Orthodox Jews who remain anti-Zionist, even though it's become a lot of Orthodox Jews are just extreme Zionists, like the Ben Gvir, Smotrich types. Another point that you kind of touched on that I want to make is talking about how this idea of Jews emigrating to Palestine amidst a sea of hostile Arabs. And actually that wasn't the case at the time, because in fact Palestine was essentially a refuge for Jews relative especially to the rampant anti-Semitism in Europe. So Jews, Arab Christians, and Muslim Christians got along. They had friendly relations in Palestine under the Ottoman Empire, which is another really, really important point to stress. And of course, there were indigenous Jews as well as indigenous Arabs. There was a small population of Jews who had kind of lived there from time immemorial, just as Arabs. And in fact, this is another point, that Jews and Arabs actually have very closely related, and they're both descended from ancient Canaanite tribes. So they are closely related. And so another point, you kind of brought up is people argue, well, Palestine was never a country. Well, it was never an independent state. Nevertheless, the Palestinian people had and have a right to self-determination that was denied to them by the British, by the Zionists, by the United States, by the League of Nations, and subsequently greatly prejudiced by the United Nations itself, such as, for example, granting Israel membership in the United Nations, despite it failing patently to meet the requirements of UN membership, such as refusing to accept its obligations under the UN Charter, and so on. And also, you brought up the point about, Europeans being kind of happy to see Jews leaving Europe and going to Palestine. And so anti-Semitism was one of the reasons for European support, non-Jewish European support for Zionism. That was one of the reasons for the Balfour Declaration. The two others one being to get Jewish support for the war effort, and to look at who the Balfour Declaration was, a private letter written from Lord Arthur Balfour, the British foreign minister, to whom? To Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, the member of the famous banking family. So we get Jewish support for the war effort, and secondly, to establish essentially a military foothold in the Middle East near the Suez Canal. So those were the three primary reasons for the British government's support of of the Zionist movement. So they had their own self-interests there. So coming back to the question here, so the point being, within Israel itself, there is not equality. This is also just a myth. It's a falsehood. It's a false claim to say that Arabs have equal rights in Israel. And just going to that one point of with the argument, well, Arabs can participate in politics and run for the Knesset and participate in the legislature. Well, and there's something called the 1958 Basic Law of the Knesset. So dating back to 1958, still in the books, hasn't changed, which essentially prohibits anyone from running for the Knesset if their party maintains that there should be equality between Jews and non-Jews. So if they negate Israel's existence as a, quote, Jewish and democratic state, then they're prohibited from participating in the electoral system, in the political process. So in other words, Arabs can only run for the Knesset if they accept as a precondition their subjugation to the Jews, if they accede to their second-class citizenship. Because of course, what they mean by a Jewish state is that that you have Jewish supremacy, and this is again in the 2018 Jewish nation state law, again explicitly defining that, like putting that into absolutely clear terms of what that means, what it means to be a Jewish state. Just completely unambiguous. It means that the right to self-determination is a right exclusive to Jews. And so if any Arabs who don't accept that, any Arabs who disagree with that and want to run on a platform of advocating equality and equal rights, including equal political rights and an equal right to self-determination, is prohibited from running. So how is that a democracy? I mean, it's the most fundamentally undemocratic state you can imagine, because if Israel, I'll put it this way, if Israel were a democracy, it would be called Palestine.
Just to be clear here, for people, you're not even talking about the occupied territories like Gaza, East Jerusalem, the West Bank. You're talking about, I think it's about 2 million Arab citizens in Israel. So they have citizenship in Israel. You're not talking about the rights of the Palestinians in the West Bank, or you're talking about actually in Israel. And just going back to the point about racism. So before we got going, I was, people see this as a religious conflict, and there is elements on both sides. But I take the view that Palestinian people, they lived here throughout the years, obviously, and then Israel came along, and however you want to see it, these people moved to Gaza and other areas. They lost their homes, whether it's forcibly through Zionist militias, or if you want to call it voluntarily, or they were scared off, whatever you want to call it. These people lost where they lived. They lost their land. Just lost my train of thought there. Religious conflict, sorry. So Palestinians' main issue isn't about religion. It's about, we used to live here, my grandparents used to live here, or even up to now, where they're forcibly removed from areas in the West Bank by very obviously Zionist settlers. And this is an open fact. A lot of people, they don't even realize, there's settlers who are backed by the state and the army who forcibly remove people from their homes, demolish their homes, take it. There was that infamous clip where that guy's in the I think it might have been in East Jerusalem, in a Palestinian's garden, just saying, this is my house now. She's like, no, it's not. He's like, well, if I don't take it, someone else will. And he's just shrugging off, and he's got like an American accent. Again, going back to...
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, يا عمي. Jacob, this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this.
But
it's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
The Jewish supremacy, they have the law, the right return, where if, say, I was Jewish and I'm living in England, I can move to Israel and just park up there, or I can go to the West Bank where Palestinians living and forcibly remove them, or at least try to. This is an open fact. So for Palestinians, I see it more about land and private property. Obviously, for Israel, it is more about religion. And I touched on earlier where they chose Palestine not because they thought it would be the most secure for Jews. They chose it because of Jerusalem and the Holy Land. That was their main motivation. And when you hear people like Ben Gurvey, Smolters, and these settlers talk about the West Bank and call it Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical term, this is very much about religion to them. And obviously there is the outside world where Muslim countries would generally back Palestine, not necessarily just because they're Muslim, but I can see there's that religious aspect. You have Christian countries in South America, Catholic countries around the world who support Palestine. Not, it's not just America and Europe have that Christian kind of view where they back Israel, but there's Christian countries who do not. So in America, where you had segregation in the 50s, Jim Crow, all that type of thing, that was, I guess, more like a colonial mindset of where white people thought they was genetically superior or above black people, and they had different laws. You had to get this part of the bus, you had to sit on this side of the restaurant, you had to use, similar in the West Bank where Jewish people can take these roads and Muslims take the other. But with that, it was more general just racism about skin color and just thinking that, genetically superior, these people are subhuman, they're unevolved, wherever it may be. Where Israel's, I guess, racism could maybe more stem from the fact the state needs to dehumanize these people in order to justify taking their land for Greater Israel, or because it was promised to them by God.
בסוף הסיבה היחידה והמוסרית שלנו להיות פה זה הבטחה שניתנה לנו מהשם יתברך.
Did you have permission to build this house when you did it?
השם יתברך נתן לנו את הזכות על הארץ ואת הרשות לבנות פה.
How do you see religion playing into the racism? And I guess the best evidence would be the settlers saying it's their right. There's great documentaries where the settlers they're just open. They're like, this is our right, it was given to us by God, and these people are on it. So do you think most of the racism stems from the government, I guess, needing to dehumanize them for the public, and also maybe just seeing them as subhuman because they was promised this land, not them? So how do you see the racism and religion playing in from the Israeli side?
Yeah, from the start, the Zionist movement, the Zionist leadership, again, secular political movement, not a religious movement, made the conscious decision to utilize Judaism as a tool to gain support for their movement. And as you mentioned, Theodor Herzl in his book, The Jewish State, Theodor Herzl considered the father of modern political Zionism. He had been looking at two options for places to go. I think, was it Argentina, and Palestine? And so he,
I think it was East Africa. They looked at Congo, because there was like the Palestinian conference about Zionism, and I think it was East Africa. They looked at Congo and a couple other places, maybe Argentina as well, but it was definitely East Africa and Congo and places like that.
He was looking at options of where to go, in terms of where should, they should have a state of their own, and where should that be. And, he wrote about how Palestine would be an ideal choice because of the religious history there. It's the Holy Land. That's where Jerusalem is. It's where the ancient kingdom of Israel was. And so, it became the obvious choice for that reason, because of the both the ethnic and religious ties that Jews have to that land. It would be easier to get Jewish support for this effort. So essentially it was a cynical policy of using people's religious beliefs to gain support for their political project, which had the consequence of radicalizing religious Jews. which we've seen. We've already touched on that, how initially Orthodox Jews were by and large opposed to Zionism because they viewed it as heretical. And these days, that's a kind of a marginal influence in Israel, where you have, there's the numbers of anti-Zionist Orthodox Jews are quite small. And you have, on the other hand, you have extremely influential, relatively large population of extreme Zionists, of the settler types, such as Ben Gvir, Schmoltrick, these types who are so influential in the Netanyahu regime, with whom Netanyahu has allied himself to remain in power. And the situation you have in the West Bank of, you have settler attacks. It's something that people maybe aren't aware of, is in addition to the genocide ongoing in Gaza, with over 40,000 now killed, Palestinians killed. That's the death toll, which is of course an underestimate because there's thousands more missing, presumed dead, buried under the rubble. But also hundreds, I think it's in the range of 450 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th. The rate of childhood deaths has been like one Palestinian child killed every other day in the West Bank. There's settler violence, and also, the Israel security forces are killing Palestinians in the West Bank, and oftentimes, the security forces are acting essentially in conjunction with the settlers, protecting the settlers, protecting them, and essentially ensuring that the settlers act with impunity. So they're not held accountable for their crimes against the Palestinians, whether it's destruction of property or violent acts against Palestinians, and including murders. So the Israeli state essentially sanctions these actions by the settler community in the West Bank. And so you've seen this extreme radicalization of the settler community, really as a direct consequence of government policies. And so, coming back to the question of, how does religion play out in all of this? Yes, there is a very strong religious aspect to it in Israel, but it's really not a religious conflict. It's religion has been used by the Zionist leadership, whether or not whatever leader is in power at a particular moment in time is even religious or not. It's just that's been an aspect of Zionism from the start. And among the Palestinians, obviously, again, there's a religious element. I mean, Hamas is a religious movement, and it's an Islamic movement. And yet you can look at 2017, Hamas put out a political manifesto, a policy document explicitly stating that their grievance was not against Jews because of their religion, but was against the state of Israel because it was anti-Zionist. They're opposed to Zionism, and they're opposed to the systematic violation of the human rights of the Palestinian people. So it's anti-Zionism, not anti-Semitism. So Hamas spelled that out explicitly in that 2017 policy document. And so again, yes, the religion obviously has a lot to do with it, especially when you're looking at Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, or the mosque compound, as it's sometimes called, Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which is how Palestinians refer to it, where you have religious Jews marching through the streets in East Jerusalem, chanting "Death to Arabs." On the Flag Day, there's this Israeli, they have this National Flag Day where Jews march through the streets of Jerusalem waving the Israeli flag, and many of those are religious Jews who are, of this extreme radical type of religious Orthodox Jews, who view all of that land from the river to the sea as belonging to them. God gave it to them, and so you have these acts of violence by settlers acting with impunity. And so, yes, obviously, there is a lot of religious element to the conflict, but it's a misperception, a misconception to view it as being a religious conflict for the reasons I've given.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And with, I guess, with Israeli society, comparing it, so you get, some people would just be like, these are just small groups of people who are religious nuts, extremists, similar to in America where you have neo Nazis. There's neo Nazis in parts of America and parts of lots of countries, but they're just a small group of people, right? They don't hold any power. They don't, you know, I don't share the belief. That's what I should have disclaimed. That I'm not, I'm more of the woke type where everything's racist. In America, you get it more than the UK, where everything's racist and everyone's a Nazi. I don't share the belief of that at all. But you do get small pockets of racist people in the UK. I think overall, the UK general public is not racist, even with what's going on at the moment. Same I'm not sure about America. I'm not from there, but from the UK, you have these small pockets of racists. So is Israel not the same as that? You just have these small pockets of racist people, or is it a little bit different? Because one, the population size is smaller, and you do have people like Ben Gurvey and Smotrich. I know we keep saying those two names, but they're the infamous ones who do hold power within the government,
Yes.
and the settlers do have influence. So is it different to say maybe some people thinking you have nutters and extremists everywhere, but they're the minority? And I'm not saying they're still not the minority in Israel, but is Israel a little bit different than a group of neo-Nazis in America or racists and wherever?
Yeah, there is a distinction because yes, obviously there are racist elements of society both here and in your country. But they're not the ones running the government. And that's the distinction, that in Israel they are. And Netanyahu isn't really quite of the same ilk as Ben Gvir and Smotrich, but he has allied himself with them precisely to remain in power. And so they really are a threat, that even though they might not be a majority in the society, and I don't know, in terms of proportions of how many people would kind of fall within that category of kind of extreme religious settler community, but they're incredibly influential in the government, which is why, which is obvious from the fact that Israel has maintained and persisted in this occupation regime since 1967. Why? Well, to appease the Jewish people who view religious Jews who view all that land as having been given to them by God, and they don't see a border or even armistice lines. The so-called Green Line, which is the boundary. It's not a border, but it's a boundary between the West Bank and Israel, and Gaza and Israel. That's the sometimes called the 1967 lines, or the Green Line, or the 1949 armistice lines. It's not a border. They are armistice lines. They remain armistice lines. But why has Israel persisted in this land grabbing policy for all of these decades? Well, it's to appease this subpopulation of Jews who view that as their land. They want it. It belongs to them. It doesn't belong to Palestinians. Palestinians shouldn't be living there. They should be kicked out. They should be expelled, and we're just going to take over the land. So they've always had a huge influence on government policy, and this explains why government policy has remained as it has for all of these decades. And this goes back to the ICJ's recent ruling that the occupation itself violates international law, because the purpose of a legitimate occupation would be one that doesn't violate international law, would be, number one, it's a temporary situation. Temporary. It's not permanent. And Israel has made its occupation permanent. And its policies speak to the aim of permanence, including like, for example, the illegal annexation of East Jerusalem, which the numerous Security Council resolutions have observed. Those measures are illegal, null and void under international law. But that's just one example of Israel taking actions deliberately to make its occupation permanent. And there are numerous other policies that really relate to permanence. And so it's not a temporary situation. And the other really big point that the ICJ made was that the occupying power under international law is legally obligated to administer the territory for the benefit of its inhabitants. And Israel has been systematically violating that obligation of its perpetually since 1967. And so essentially for those two main reasons.
Just on Jerusalem, just quickly explain to people, you've obviously got the West Bank, you've got Gaza, which is Palestinian, and you've got Israel, but Jerusalem is like a free zone, right? It'll be run by the United Nations. I can't remember the term for it. I'm sure you know it. Where Jerusalem isn't the territory of Israel or Palestine, if I'm correct.
Well, the partition plan, going back to Resolution 181 and the partition plan that the General Assembly had endorsed in that resolution, had called for Jerusalem to be essentially held in trust by the international community, kind of an international zone. However, again, that plan was never implemented. And so what happened was violence broke out. The Zionists, in what Israeli historian Benny Morris has described as their, quote, war of conquest, conquered land well beyond that had been proposed for them under the partition plan. The partition plan had, despite Jews owning only about 7% of the land and being the minority, the partition plan was advocating a Jewish state comprised of about 55% of the territory of Palestine, which of course Arabs were within reason to reject as wholly inequitable. And so during the 1948 war, the Zionist forces went beyond that proposal and conquered land, about so today that the Palestinians are asking, when the PLO in 1988 accepted the two-state solution on just 22% of its of their historic homeland, that was a huge concession on the part of the Palestinians, because during the 1948 war, Israel conquered 78% of the territory, and so including West Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was essentially divided as a result of that war. And Jordan tried to stop the ethnic cleansing and managed to hold on to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Egyptian forces managed to hold on to the tiny Gaza Strip. And so for quite a few decades, the West Bank was administered by the Jordanian government and Gaza was administered by Egypt. But following the 1967 war and the occupation of those territories, along with the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, Resolution 242 for the UN Security Council, emphasizing the principle that under international law that it is inadmissible to acquire territory by force, called on Israel to withdraw to the positions it held prior to June 5th, 1967, which were the 1949 armistice lines. And this is why they're sometimes called the 1967 lines, because of the situation in 1967 in UN Resolution 242. And so that was a requirement of Israel to withdraw. And there's also lots of myths about the interpretation of UN Resolution 242, and you'll hear Zionists argue that it didn't call on Israel to completely withdraw its forces or to fully withdraw, that Israel could keep some of the land. And the Israeli interpretation is that essentially that the Palestinian people must negotiate with their oppressors over how much of their own land they can keep and live in, and potentially maybe someday exercise some kind of limited autonomy over. But this is completely contrary to the requirements of international law. That's not what UN Resolution 242 says, and it's wholly incompatible with the principles, especially looking at the principle emphasized in the preambular section of that resolution. It's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. And the ICJ, in its recent ruling, reaffirmed that the right to self-determination is an inherent, inalienable right, that Israel can take no actions that prejudice that right or that places conditions on the Palestinians' exercise of that right. And so essentially, this was another major significance of the ICJ's recent ruling. Essentially, the ICJ repudiated the entire framework of the U.S.-led so-called peace process, because, of course, the U.S. government, under the so-called peace process, essentially accepted Israel's unilateral interpretation of Resolution 242, which is completely untenable. And if you go back to the UN meeting records, you can see that it was the intent of the Security Council, again, emphasizing that principle of international law, that Israel must fully and immediately withdraw its forces to the 1949 armistice lines. That was explicit in the meeting records. And so you have this whole kind of revisionist history by the Zionists attempting to claim that that's not what the resolution meant. It is what the resolution meant. That was the intent and the meaning of the Resolution 242. So that's another important part of the history going back to 1967.
Just going back to something you said just before, I want to get to the West Bank, because I think the checkpoints, the treatment of the Palestinians there, separate to Hamas, is one of the greater examples. But going back to what you said, just to clarify for people, where you said, because we keep picking on Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, which they should be, and people should be familiar with them. Just, I think I saw something again. I think it was from a few years back, but Ben-Gvir saying, the rights of my family and Jews or anyone in the West Bank is just greater and above the Palestinians. And why we bring up those two figures is they was actually born in the occupied territory, so they're settlers from there. No, they're not actually born in the Israeli state. But we keep picking on them. So when you say Netanyahu, to stay in power, had to make a deal with these more right-wing forces, which even, most of the media is obviously pro-Israel. But when this new government came in, you heard all these statements like this is the most far-right Israeli government of all time. And obviously there is a bit of the element of they prefer the opposition in Israel because they give a better look PR-wise to Israel. And again, I don't like the word far right when it's used in the US and the UK all the time. Just like on the other side, everyone's saying anything against Israel is anti-Semitic. Is the left, right, both do the same nonsense. But what do you mean he had to form an alliance with these more right-wing forces? So how did that keep him in power? And would that then mean Israeli society as a whole are more leaning towards that? So if he had to stay in power to be voted in, he had to join forces with the extreme side, would that not mean Israeli society is leaning more towards the extreme side to keep him in, or is there a different dynamic? I'm asking for myself as well, because I've heard this a few times. I just wondered how it kind of plays out and how it all comes together.
Yeah, I don't actually follow the minute details of Israeli politics or U.S. politics for that matter, because I tend to kind of focus on the big picture and do more systems analysis, and so I don't really pay all that much attention to individuals within the system. Obviously, they can be relevant at times, and you can hardly have a conversation about various issues without bringing up specific names of people. But I do more of what I describe as systems analysis. So, without getting into the minutia of the details of the Israeli political system, essentially, I just mean that, to remain prime minister, and avoid having to go into elections, he had to gain enough support from other political parties in the Knesset, including the parties of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And so that's what I mean when I say that he remains in power as a result of his alliance with them. Their support for his government has enabled him to stay on as prime minister, despite all the controversy about his corruption, the corruption charges against him, despite all the controversy surrounding what the Israeli media often referred to as his judicial coup, the attempt to reform the judiciary, essentially to eliminate it as an obstacle to the implementation of his political aims, which is essentially the takeover of the West Bank. and which you saw when he spoke 2 weeks before 10/7 in September of 2013, and Netanyahu was at the UN General Assembly speaking before the assembly, and he held up that map showing what he called the new Middle East, and it showed Israel from the river to the sea with no Palestinian territories and no state of Palestine, obviously. And he was essentially mocking the Palestinians and saying, "We won, you lost. This is our land." And of course, he referred to the normalization, quote unquote, normalization of relations with Arab states, the Abraham Accords. At the time, the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia were in talks, trying to negotiate some kind of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so Netanyahu was basically doing a victory dance in the General Assembly, mocking the Palestinians and saying, "We won, you lost." And the world was just watching him do this. This speaks to his arrogance and the perception that the Jewish nation state had conquered that land, and the Palestinians would just have to accept their fate and just have to learn to live. And as far as he was concerned, the people of Gaza were essentially isolated in what in 2004, at the time, the head of Israel's National Security Council, Giora Island, described as a concentration camp. So as far as Netanyahu was concerned, the people of Gaza were confined to the concentration camp, and the people in the West Bank were confined to their Bantustan-like little enclaves within, because of course the West Bank, under the Oslo Accords, was divided up into different areas, and the Palestinian Authority, which was created as a part of the Oslo process, as a sub-agency of the PLO, and essentially for the purpose of the PA, the role of the PA that Israel envisioned was that it would serve essentially as Israel's collaborator in enforcing its occupation regime. And so it exercises very limited autonomy in certain enclaves only. But for the most part, the West Bank is controlled by Israel, both administrative and security jurisdiction. And so that's the way Netanyahu viewed it, is, we got the Palestinians, they're in the Gaza concentration camp, and they're in their little enclaves, their Bantustans in the West Bank, and that's the way it is. They're just going to have to accept that as their fate. There's never going to be a Palestinian state. We're never going to allow that, and you're just going to have to get over it and accept Jewish dominance. And he's been explicit about that. And this is one of the reasons that Netanyahu maintained a policy of supporting, of treating Hamas as a strategic ally. Coming to 10/7 again, related to 10/7, treating Hamas as a strategic ally for the specific purpose of blocking any movement toward peace negotiations with the Palestinians. So this is the government you have in Israel.
Yeah, I recently had Connor Freeman on, who did an article with Scott Horton about Israel and Netanyahu propping up Hamas to split Gaza and the West Bank. And I know you've done some work on that yourself as well with Scott. Just before we start finishing up and get on, just if we could do the West Bank before, just some other examples, I guess, in general Israeli society of this. Obviously, recently we had, is it Smotrich or Ben-Gvir who in charge of the settlements and things like that, where they just authorized the biggest land grab in 30 years. And again, they call the West Bank Judea and Samaria for a reason, because of biblical reasons. You have that. You have, I guess, a similar situation again, where during the War on Terror, Muslims were dehumanized, where they was tortured, they could be killed. All this sketchy stuff that happened through the War on Terror was allowed through the pretext, not necessarily always racism. That was, the blowback from 9/11. But again, in Israeli society, we see this. There've been recent scandals with torture. The UN's highlighted. You've had this recent thing with Israeli soldiers allegations of raping Palestinians, and then you had Israelis storm the base where these soldiers were arrested by the Israeli forces, saying they were heroes. And again, you're going back to like Ben Gurion and Smotrich saying these people were heroes. They go to the conferences in Gaza. They go on these marches. They back, storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. All this stuff that's just rifling up tensions, not making anything safer. Again, it always goes back to people want to say, this is about the security of Israeli citizens. How does expanding settlements in the West Bank keep you safer? Is it about security, or is it about your religious goals? Which one do you want? And that is some of the debate in Israel. Do we keep what we've got, or do we keep pushing on? Then there's the obviously further extremist settlers. So going to the West Bank, because it is the clearest example. And I just want to make clear as well, when I'm chucking around, I guess, the word racism, some of it's racism, some of it's just these people are just in our way, and we want the land. It's not just Muslims, because you have Palestinian Christians who are being killed. You have in East Jerusalem, Jeremy Lafredo from the Grey Zone did a good bit. He went all the way to East Jerusalem and spoke to Armenian Christians who are obviously European descendants about how Israeli settlers and these companies, private companies, are trying to get them off their land, and they had to set up 24/7 camera systems to keep them away, again, backed by the army. It's not just about Muslims and Jews. It's Christians as well, and I guess that plays into the fact that it isn't that black and white. It is also to do with they want this land, they want Jerusalem. So again, just examples through the war of Israelis just killing Palestinians for fun. And I'm not saying this is a policy, but you see clips where there's like Palestinian running away, clearly unarmed, and they drone bomb them. And then they get the next guy, or he stumbles over, they drone bomb. You have Israelis who went out their way. Already the Israeli state is blocking aid. Everyone said they weren't. They're not blocking aid. And then the US kept pressuring them, and then they opened one of the areas that let in aid. So clearly there's blocking it because part of these to ease the tensions, they let it in. But you had actual Israeli citizens months on end going to these checkpoints and just destroying aid, just straight up, just pulling aid, chucking it on the floor.
תראו, חבר'ה פה לא מפחדים, בחורות, בחורים, איזה יופי, עושים את המשאיות של החמאס, מקסימה.
It is a total outrage that there are people who are attacking and looting these convoys coming from Jordan, going to Gaza to deliver humanitarian assistance. We are looking at the tools that we have to respond to this, and we are also raising our concerns at the highest level of the Israeli government, and it's something that we make no bones about. This is completely and utterly unacceptable behavior.
Doing, sending videos, putting on TikTok, Israelis in Palestinian homes, riding little children's bikes, all these things, mocking them. If you believe we had an actual terrorist attack from Hamas threatened, and you sign up, I can understand that line of thinking. But where they're mocking them, you can see they just see them as something to kind of play with. And there's just so many examples of this. And there's one-offs, and then there's systematic things as well. But with the West Bank specifically, I think is the clearest example of the rights for one against the other, when you want to call it racism, segregation, land grabs, or whatever. Can you just explain the dynamics in the West Bank, just how bad it is with the checkpoints, with the wall, with the laws for the Israeli settlers who shouldn't be there? It's illegal by the UN standards. Even though the Obama administration didn't veto the resolution in 2014, and everything in the West Bank that just shows, whatever word you want to call it, just the treatment of the Palestinians, and the clear the way the Israelis are treated versus the Palestinians in occupied territory?
Yeah, sure. Just generally, again, going back to the arrangement under the Oslo Accords, which was essentially Yasser Arafat capitulated to Israel's demands and the U.S. demands because he had no leverage to do anything else at the time, even though the PLO had already issued its own declaration of independence. So the PLO in 1988 declared the independent state of Palestine, and then he walked that back by agreeing to the Oslo Accords, which again, as I mentioned, kind of essentially divided the West Bank into what they called areas A, B, and C. And in the area, I might get these mixed up, but I think it was Area A would have essentially complete Israeli control. In Area B, the PA would exercise, I think, administrative jurisdiction, but Israel would retain security control. And then in Area C, the PA could exercise both administrative and security jurisdiction, roughly along those lines. And then you have the major settlement blocks, which are constructed in violation of international law, as we've mentioned, that are essentially strategically located to divide up the West Bank into to really render it impossible for the Palestinians to ever carve out an independent state of their own in the West Bank in contiguous territory. So you have these settlement blocks running deep within the West Bank, and then the illegal separation wall, which I describe as an annexation wall because that is essentially its purpose, was to de facto annex this territory, strategically built to encompass the major settlement blocks. You have, as you mentioned, Jewish-only highways where Palestinians are not allowed to travel there, so they have no freedom of movement in the West Bank. And anytime they want to get someplace, they've got to travel through Israeli security checkpoints. They're not allowed on the Jew-only highways. And you have situations where, for example, ambulances can't get through and people die as a result of, not being able to get through security checkpoints and things. So it's a system of completely discriminatory policies and practices, as the ICJ pointed out. You have Palestinians being unable to, maybe they want to build a water cistern or a shed or something on their land, and they require Israel's permission to do that. And they require Israel's permission to do things that are really essential to their livelihoods and their survival. And Israel will deny them those things just arbitrarily. The settler community will come and attack and destroy Palestinian property with impunity, attacking Palestinians, sometimes murderously, sometimes killing Palestinians, again, with impunity, not with just the state looking the other way, but sometimes with the active support of the state. You have, this was one of the things that Netanyahu had done prior to 10/7, was essentially shifting military resources from the armistice line along Gaza into the West Bank, essentially to protect the settler community and to ensure that the settlers would carry out their destruction of property and land confiscations with the support of the Israeli security establishment. So this is the situation in the West Bank. Palestinians, their fundamental human rights are systematically violated by, again, what has been described by international human rights organizations, UN bodies, and implicitly by the ICJ itself as an apartheid regime.
Yeah, some of the stuff they do in the West Bank, where like just little things like destroying cattle, killing cattle, destroying olive branches, lots of olive branches there, which they grow, destroying them, just like little stuff. And again, just general humiliation of the Palestinians. And again, whatever you think about Hamas as an organization or terrorist militia, or whatever you want to call them, and what they did on October 7th, which we discussed before, we both said obviously we do not justify the killing of civilians, even with what led up to that with Israelis. Whatever you think about that, just the West Bank is just glaring in your face. There's obviously still elements of terrorism there on the Palestinian side and groups there. But it's just the best example, really, of the humiliation Israel sets up for the Palestinians with these checkpoints that takes hours to get through, as you said. And they're allowed to carry guns. Palestinians can't. And the Israelis are setting all these rules in a territory they illegally occupy. They clearly have their eyes on the West Bank. Recently there was that article with, was it Miriam Alderson? I can't remember. Her husband recently died, who big donor has just said they're going to contribute to the Trump campaign, potentially up to 100 million, with their eyes on a full annexation of the West Bank. You had Trump, the Trump administration move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Again, why Jerusalem? Very obvious reasons why.
Which was illegal, by the way.
Which was
illegal. That was a violation of international law for the U.S. to move its embassy because the U.S. is a member of the UN, and it violated numerous UN Security Council resolutions, which are binding on member states. So it was illegal. Yeah.
But
and Sheldon Adelson, I think, is who you're referring to there.
Yeah, sorry, Adelson. Yeah, he's obviously recently died, so now his wife stepped up the part. And she was just with Trump at like against anti-Semitism conference. And Trump, this is the good thing about Trump, he just sometimes just says it how it is. He was like, it's such a shame. 10, 15 years ago, the Israel lobby, the most powerful lobby in the US, no politician, no person would dare speak out against them because you knew what would happen. You wouldn't dare. But now, it's not quite as powerful, and that's such a shame.
And if you say, let's say 15 years ago, maybe not even that long, anything bad about Israel or Jewish people, you were finished as a politician, right? You were finished. You wouldn't do that, Congressman. You wouldn't do it anyway, but nobody would do it. The most powerful lobby in this country, by far, was Israel and Jewish people. Today, it's almost like, what happened? What happened? What happened to Schumer? What happened to all these people? Schumer's like a Palestinian, right?
He's just right there. They're at an anti-Semitism conference, and part of genuine anti-Semitism is people saying Jews run the world, the Jews did this, the Jews did that, Jews did that, which is obviously complete bullshit. But the Israel lobby and Zionism, where they do have influence over politicians, that is kind of a dagger in themselves of the anti-Semitism argument. You're creating a scenario where everyone goes, look what the Jews did. They control the United States, which means that the United States, everything they do is to do with the Jews, rather than separating Israelis and Zionism and Judaism. It actually plays into anti-Semitism because the Jews clearly do not run the world. This is just nonsense, which has been a theory that's been around for a long time, which on their side of arguments, that is obviously true. But just to finish up, I'd like to thank you for coming on again. Always enjoy having you on. I encourage people to check out your work, check out your books. We covered a lot, but there's still just so much with the Israelis, the amount of permits they give out, work permits, housing, prison rates, Israelis getting charged. There's just so many different angles to it. And, I kept chucking around the word racism. It may not always be accurate in specific things. There's different levels to it, whatever you want to call it. I guess the general discrimination Israelis do towards Palestinians in policies, in laws. You mentioned one, there was the bill that got voted down in the Knesset, I think in 2020, giving Palestinian citizens of Israel, Arab citizens of Israel, equal rights. That was voted down. The whole, just them not wanting to give Israel wanting to give Palestine a state. Recently, they voted to not allow that, which again, it's just all quite tied in. There's a lot to discuss. Whether you agree or disagree, you're pro-Israel or you're on the Palestinian side, you have to see there's issues on both sides with Hamas. I'm not for Hamas, but you have to be critical of Israel because at the end of the day, Israel is a government, it's a state. It's meant to be a democracy. It's meant to be Western civilization. So when people always go, why don't you say about Hamas? Well, Hamas is a resistance organization that uses terrorism. They are a group of terrorists, but they are focused. They don't do random bombings like Al Qaeda in European cities. They are a resistance group, but they do use terrorist acts, clearly, as we saw on October 7th. So at the end of the day, you have to put it on the state, who are meant to not act like that, to behave normally in war and things they've been doing. So that's why I normally go more towards Israel, because I'm not here to critique Al Qaeda and ISIS and Hamas, and they are very, very different organizations. I want to make that clear. We're here to critique Israel because it's meant to be this shining light in the Middle East. But thanks for coming on. I'm not sure if you want to say anything else before we finish, but you have given me 20 minutes over. So I'm happy to leave it how it is. But I'll put all your links in the show notes and up on the screen. Was there anything you want to finish with, or any recommendations of what?
Just on that same point you were just making, I just want to add, people sometimes will try to accuse me of hypocrisy for focusing my criticisms on the state of Israel. And, well, why don't you? And of course, obviously, I am a critic of Hamas as well. I'm a huge critic of the Palestinian Authority, as you've already heard. And so, number one, they're kind of ignoring that I am critical of crimes committed by Palestinians, whether against Israelis or against other Palestinians. But setting that aside, I focus on Israel's crimes against the Palestinians because, well, the U.S. government, which claims to support me, doesn't support Palestinians' crimes against Israelis, but it does support Israel's crimes against the Palestinians, and that makes it a moral imperative to focus on that aspect of the conflict from my perspective. And so I think that's an important point to make there, just to wrap up and follow along what you were saying. Beyond that, if people want to stay with my work, I would encourage them to read my book, Obstacle to Peace, the U.S. Role in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, which you can actually just go to my website, jeremyrhammond.com, sign up to my newsletter while you're there, and you can get signed copies of that book directly from me. You can cut out the middleman and buy copies directly from me on that site. And I have a number of smaller books on the conflict as well, covering different aspects of the conflict. But Obstacle to Peace is my really big one. So I encourage anyone who wants to learn more about the conflict, you can do a deep dive into it with that book.
Yeah, I'll put that in the show notes up on the screen. And just to add on, I will finish it as well. When people say, what about the Arab states like Egypt and the Gulf nations, they're complicit. Yeah, agree. People always point, no. Why do you never talk about them? No, they are too. And Saudi Arabia, what happened in Yemen, what they did, blockade, 377,000 people died, mostly under 5. Yep, and they did a blockade, same as Israel, but Israel used language like human animals and they're nothing and they're monsters, and that's where I guess it's a little bit different. Where Saudi Arabia was a different thing, but I'll leave it there because we're just gonna keep going round and round and round. But thanks for coming on, Jeremy, and I hope to speak sometime soon.
Sure, thanks for having me on again.